My name is Olivia Williams. I was 35 years old and I owned a house at 214 Birchwood Lane outright, free and clear, with my name and only my name on the deed. I want you to remember that detail, the deed. Because in about 4 minutes, a woman is going to stand in my dining room and call my mother the maid, and she is going to say it with a smile in front of 12 guests, while resting her hand on a table I paid for in cash. She had no idea what was sitting in the drawer 6 feet behind her. If you're new here, welcome to Legacy Belle, and this is where we tell the stories nobody else will say out loud. The quiet betrayals, the slow reveals, the moments when someone finds out exactly who they were talking to. Subscribe if you want to see how this one ends, and tell me in the comments, has anyone in your family ever tried to erase you from your own home? Now, let me take you back to the beginning, because you need to understand what my mother gave up before you understand what Vivienne tried to take. I grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat in Fenimore, raised by a woman who mended other people's clothes for $11 an hour, and never once let me see her cry about it. My mother, Rosalind Ferris, was 58 when this story starts. She had sewn wedding dresses for women who wouldn't say hello to her at the grocery store. She had worked 6 days a week for 22 years so that I could take an unpaid accounting internship instead of a paying retail job. When I graduated and got my CPA license, the first check I wrote was to pay off her car. The second was to put a new roof over that laundromat apartment she still refused to leave. By the time I was 32, I had saved enough from 6 years at a mid-size accounting firm and 1 very good year consulting for a client who sold his company to buy a house outright. No mortgage, no cosigner, $281,000 wired in full, closing on a Tuesday in March. I remember exactly what my mother wore the day she first walked through that front door. A gray cardigan she'd made herself, the same one she'd wear again years later at that Thanksgiving table. She stood in the entryway for a long time without saying anything, running her fingers along the banister like she couldn't quite believe the wood was real. Then she looked at me and said, quietly, "You don't have to prove anything to me, you know. I already knew what you were made of." I have thought about that sentence more times than I can count in the years since, especially on the nights this story got hardest to live through. My mother never once asked for her name to be on anything I owned. She never asked for a room, a key, an allowance, or a single dollar back for the 22 years she spent making sure I never went without. She asked for exactly one thing over the entire decade I knew her as an adult daughter instead of a dependent child, that I never let anyone make her feel small for the years she spent working with her hands. I promised her that easily, the way you promise things you can't yet imagine being tested on. I married Julian Williams 8 months after I closed on that house. He moved in. I never once considered adding his name to the deed, and he never once asked me to. That was fine, until it wasn't fine for everyone else in his family. Julian's sister was named Vivienne Williams Hart, and she was the kind of beautiful that made rooms go quiet before she said a word. She ran a boutique on the good side of downtown, married a man named Preston who worked in commercial real estate, and had built an entire personality around the idea that the Willems were a certain kind of family, the kind with standards. The first time I met her, at a dinner Julian's parents hosted a month before our wedding, Vivienne complimented my dress, asked thoughtful questions about my career, and made me feel, for exactly one evening, like I had been fully accepted into something bigger than myself. She had a gift for making people feel chosen, right up until the moment she decided they weren't useful to her anymore. I didn't see that second half yet. Nobody does, at first. Julian told me once, early in our relationship, that Vivienne had always been the one their parents leaned on to keep things looking right. The seating charts, the family photos, the version of the Willems that got presented to the world. I understand now that a person raised to manage appearances for a living develops a very specific kind of fear, the fear of what happens when the appearance stops matching the reality underneath it. I didn't know yet how far she'd go to keep that gap hidden. Vivian had a phrase she said so often it became a kind of punctuation. "Presentation is everything, darling." She said it about flower arrangements. She said it about Christmas cards. She said it, the first time I ever heard her say it about a person, while looking directly at my mother's hands. The first crack came at Easter, 7 months into my marriage. My mother had brought a lemon cake, homemade, in a tin she'd owned since before I was born. Vivian took one look at the tin and asked, lightly, almost as a joke, whether the caterer had been told we were doing a sit-down dessert instead of buffet style. Nobody corrected her. My mother laughed it off. I told myself it was a misunderstanding, the kind of thing that happens when two families from different worlds share a table for the first time. I did not say anything. That was my first mistake. After that, it became a pattern I could see only in hindsight. At the 4th of July barbecue, Vivian asked my mother to help refill the ice in front of Julian's father. At Julian's birthday dinner, she asked her to check on dessert plates in the kitchen, the same kitchen my mother had never once been asked to enter as staff, only ever as a guest. Each time, alone, it looked like nothing. Together, it was a shape I refused to name. I started noticing something else, too, in the months that followed. Vivian's boutique had quietly stopped carrying its spring line. She'd started asking Julian, very casually over drinks, how the house was holding its value and whether we'd ever thought about what a place like that would appraise for if you ever needed to move quickly. I filed it away without understanding it yet. I want you to file it away too, because it matters later. There was a Sunday brunch in September, small, just Julian's parents and Vivian and Preston, where Vivian spent 20 minutes talking about a friend of a friend who'd sold a house like ours to a developer for well over market value. She kept circling back to it, the way people do when they're not really talking about someone else. Julian's father nodded along, half listening, and I remember thinking it was strange how much detail she had. Square footage comparisons, lot size, a number for what a corner property like ours might fetch if it were ever on the table. Nobody at that table asked why she knew so much. I did, quietly, in my head, and I didn't like the answer I was starting to imagine. My mother was at that brunch, too. Vivian asked her in passing whether she'd ever thought about downsizing from the laundromat apartment, since my mother had mentioned once that the building's owner was retiring. It sounded like idle concern. It wasn't. I understand now that Vivian was always circling money, always testing which doors in this family might open if she pushed the right way, and my mother's modest apartment was just one more door she was quietly trying handles on. By the following spring, the small betrayals had a rhythm. First, it was a comment about my mother's clothes, calling her cardigan sweet, very practical. Then it was money, Vivian borrowing $40 from my mother at a family lunch and never once mentioning it again, as though my mother's money didn't require the courtesy of being remembered. Then it was worse, Vivian telling Julian's aunt within earshot of my mother that some people just have that helpful energy, don't they, and laughing in a way that made 3 people at the table go still. At a graduation party for one of Julian's cousins in June, Vivian asked my mother to help carry a folding table in from the garage, in front of a dozen people who had no idea my mother had been a guest for 8 years by then, and not once an employee of anybody. My mother did it without a word of complaint, the way she'd done everything her whole life, quietly, competently, refusing to give anyone the satisfaction of a reaction. I watched her carry that table across the lawn and felt something harden in my chest that had nothing to do with the summer heat. Then there was the matter of the borrowed $40 becoming a pattern. By August, Vivian had asked my mother for small amounts 3 separate times: gas money before a road trip, a contribution toward a birthday gift for Julian's father, cash for a parking meter outside her boutique, and had repaid none of it. It wasn't about the money. My mother would have given her the world if she'd simply asked with respect. It was the assumption underneath it, the quiet certainty that a woman who mended clothes for a living existed in Vivian's mind to be useful to people who didn't have to ask twice.
I brought it up to Julian once, carefully, in October, saying I thought his sister had a strange habit of treating my mother like hired help. He told me I was reading too much into it, that Vivian just wasn't good at small talk with people outside her circle, and that I shouldn't take it personally. I let it go because I loved him, and because I still believed, that October, that this was clumsiness and not intention. I was wrong, but I understand now why I wanted to be wrong. It's easier to forgive clumsiness than cruelty, and I wasn't ready yet to admit which one I was actually watching. It built to the night that changed everything. We were hosting Thanksgiving. My house, my dining room, the one with the bay window I picked out myself and the chandelier I bought from an estate sale for $600 because I loved the way the light broke through the crystal. 14 people were seated. My mother had brought her chipped blue teacup, the one that had belonged to her own mother, the one she carried to every family gathering in a felted pouch because it was the only thing she owned from a childhood she rarely spoke about. Vivian saw the caterer pouring wine and, gesturing toward my mother's end of the table, said to the caterer, clear enough for the whole room to hear, "Oh, don't worry about her. She's the maid. She'll clear when we're done." The table went silent. My mother's hands went still around that chipped blue cup, and Vivian smiled because in her mind she had made an observation, not a wound. She had no idea whose name was on the deed of the house she was standing in. I want you to hold on to that moment because there's a detail sitting 6 feet behind Vivian at that exact second that's going to matter enormously by the end of this story. The manila folder in the sideboard drawer, the one with the title report inside it. Remember the drawer. If you're still with me, hit subscribe now because Legacy Bell exists for exactly this moment, the one where somebody's about to find out they read the room wrong. Tell me below, what's the worst thing an in-law has ever said about someone you love? I did not raise my voice that night. I have never once raised my voice at Vivian, not in 8 years of marriage to her brother. I simply stood, walked to my mother's chair, put my hand on her shoulder, and said, "My mother doesn't work here. She raised the person who bought it." Then I asked the caterer to bring my mother a fresh glass of the good wine, and I sat back down. Julian said nothing that night. That hurt almost as much as Vivian's comment did. I told myself he was caught off guard. I told myself a lot of things that November. 2 weeks later, I learned why Vivian had really been asking about the house's value. Her boutique had quietly closed its second location in October, a fact she had not told the family. Preston, her husband, had cut off her discretionary spending after a joint account overdrew twice in 1 quarter. She owed her landlord back rent on the flagship store, and she owed a supplier nearly $19,000 for inventory she'd already sold and never paid for. I didn't learn this from gossip. I learned it because my mother, quietly and without any agenda, mentioned that a real estate agent named Carla Denny had called our house the week before Thanksgiving asking to confirm a walkthrough time, and that when my mother said she must have the wrong number, the woman had apologized and mentioned the name Willem's Hart before hanging up. I run financial audits for a living. That single loose thread was enough for me to start pulling. Time moved strangely after that. Christmas came and went, tense and formal. Vivian was polite to my mother now, overly polite, the kind of politeness that feels like a held breath. I smiled through 2 family dinners and said nothing about Carla Denny. I wanted to know exactly what I was dealing with before I said a single word. January brought its own quiet escalations. Vivian started dropping references to the market at every gathering, asking Julian's father whether he thought interest rates would keep falling, whether now was actually a smart time to sell if someone were thinking about it. She never looked at me when she said it. She didn't have to. I began keeping a private log on my phone. Dates, quotes, small details, the kind of documentation habit that 11 years in accounting had trained into me long before I ever needed it for something personal.
I dated every entry. I didn't know yet what I was building a case for. I only knew I no longer trusted the shape of what I was watching. By the end of January, my mother had quietly stopped coming to Sunday brunches, telling me she had a lot of mending work those weekends. I knew it wasn't true. She had simply gotten tired of being the only person in the room whose presence needed constant, small justification. I didn't push her to come back. I told her I understood, and I meant it. But every week she stayed home felt like one more inch of ground I was letting Vivian take without a fight. In February, I found it. My title company flagged an inquiry on my property, a request for a preliminary title report, filed by a licensing agent at Denny Realty Group, listing an authorized representative for the seller. The name on that authorization line was Naomi Willems. My name. My signature, or something built to pass as it. I had never spoken to Carla Denny in my life. I had never signed anything authorizing a listing, walkthrough, or appraisal of my house. Someone had forged my name to open the door to selling my home out from under me, and I intended to find out exactly who. The signature on that authorization form was close. It was close enough that a stranger glancing at it might not blink. But it wasn't mine, and more importantly, it didn't match the signature on file with my county notary from when I closed on the house 3 years earlier. Notary log entry 4412, dated the Tuesday in March I've already told you about. Forged signatures are rarely perfect. This one had my A's rounded the wrong way and a flourish under the Y that I have never once made in my life.
I spent an entire Saturday pulling every document I had with my real signature on it. My closing paperwork, my passport renewal, 3 years of tax filings, and laying them side by side with a printout of the authorization form. I am not a handwriting expert, but I am someone who reconciles numbers for a living, someone trained to notice when two things that are supposed to match don't. By the fourth comparison, I wasn't second-guessing myself anymore. Somebody had studied my signature closely enough to get close and not closely enough to get it right. I called the title company Monday morning and asked, as calmly as I could manage, how a preliminary title inquiry gets initiated without the owner's direct involvement. The representative explained that an authorized representative letter, notarized or not, depending on the county, was sometimes accepted at the preliminary stage before a full closing package was required. It was a loophole built for legitimate power of attorney situations, the kind used when an owner is traveling or incapacitated. It was never meant for this. I asked for a copy of everything on file with my name on it, and the woman on the phone, apologetic and clearly uncomfortable, said she'd have the documents to me by end of day. I called my attorney the same afternoon. Her name was Diane Whitfield, and she had handled my closing 3 years before. I told her everything: the forged authorization, the notary discrepancy, Carla Denny's call to my mother, and 8 months of small, deniable cruelty that had somehow led here. Diane told me something I've repeated to myself since. "You don't confront a fire with your bare hands," she said. "You document it, you starve it of oxygen, and then you let it burn out where everyone can see exactly who lit the match." That became my plan: quiet, paper-based, no public blow-up, no accusation across a dinner table where Vivian could cry and turn the room against me. Just documentation, patience, and one very specific date circled on Diane's calendar. For 6 weeks, I said almost nothing. I hosted one family dinner and smiled through Vivian's comment about my very rustic center table runner. I let her believe she had won something. That was the hardest part, letting her believe the silence meant surrender. Then, in March, something happened that I never could have planned for. Julian's cousin, Renata, who had always been quiet at family gatherings, the kind of relative who observes more than she speaks, called me on a Tuesday evening. She said she'd been thinking about Thanksgiving for months and hadn't been able to shake it.
She told me Vivian had called her back in January, half drunk and venting, and had said, Renata played me the actual voicemail because Vivian had accidentally left it on Renata's phone instead of hanging up. I just need the listing to go through before Preston finds the bank statement. Naomi doesn't even care about that house the way we do. It should have been ours anyway.
I sat with that voicemail for a long time before I said anything to anyone. Renata hadn't needed to hand it to me. She wasn't obligated, and she barely knew me beyond family holidays. But she told me she'd watched Vivian humiliate my mother for a year and couldn't keep pretending it was nothing. That was the hidden advantage I never saw coming. Not a lucky break I engineered myself, but a woman I'd underestimated deciding that decency mattered more than family loyalty to someone who didn't deserve it. Renata told me one more thing on that call that I've never forgotten. She said that at a family barbecue 2 summers earlier, before I'd even married Julian, she'd once heard Vivian joke to a friend that the Willems collect people the way other families collect china. You just have to know which pieces are for display and which ones are for use. Renata hadn't understood the comment at the time. She understood it now, watching how carefully Vivian had spent a year deciding which category my mother belonged in. 2 weeks after that call, my in-laws found out everything, and not from me. Preston had discovered the missing $19,000 on his own, going through a shared line of credit statement. The same week, Vivian's landlord filed for eviction on the flagship store. Word moves fast in families that pretend to have no secrets. By the time Julian's mother called me, crying, asking if it was true that someone had tried to sell my house without my knowledge, I had already had Diane draft a formal cease and desist to Denny Realty Group and a fraud report ready to file with the county recorder's office. For about 10 days, it looked like I had lost the family, even though I hadn't done anything wrong. Preston's mother suggested gently that maybe Vivian was just under a lot of pressure and that airing this publicly would destroy the family. My mother, watching all of this unfold, quietly told me she didn't think she should come to Easter that year, that she didn't want to be the reason anyone fought. I remember standing in my kitchen holding the phone, feeling like the house I'd paid for in full had somehow become a place I was being asked to apologize for owning. Julian's aunt called me directly during that stretch, something she had never done before, to ask whether I was sure I wanted to go through with something so drastic over what she calls a paperwork mix-up. I asked her, evenly, whether she would call a forged signature on a legal document a mix-up if it happened to her. She didn't have an answer for that, only a long pause and a comment about how families should handle things internally. I hung up the phone that night and sat alone in my dining room for a long time, looking at the chandelier I'd bought for $600 at an estate sale, wondering if owning something outright meant anything at all if everyone around you kept insisting you shared the decision-making anyway. Julian himself went quiet during those 10 days in a way that frightened me more than any argument could. He didn't defend Vivian outright, but he didn't stand firmly beside me either, caught in the particular paralysis of a man who had spent his whole life being the peacekeeper in a family that rewarded silence over honesty. I asked him one night, directly, whether he believed me about the forged signature. He said of course he did. I asked him why, then, he hadn't said a single word to his mother correcting her use of the phrase paperwork mix-up. He didn't have an answer either. That was its own kind of lowest point, quieter than the others. The sense that even the people closest to me needed time to decide whose side the truth was on. That was the lowest point. Not the forgery, not even the humiliation at Thanksgiving. It was watching my own mother, the woman who had sacrificed 22 years of 6-day work weeks so I could stand on my own 2 feet, quietly offer to disappear so that everyone else could stay comfortable. I told her no. I told her she was coming to Easter this time, and that this time she was sitting at the head of the table. I met with Diane one more time before Easter. We confirmed the notary discrepancy in writing, attached the voicemail transcript with Renata's signed statement, and prepared a full timeline, dates, dollar amounts, the $19,000 owed to the supplier,
the $9,200 Denny Realty had already quietly accepted from an interested buyer as an earnest deposit against a sale that could never legally happen. Diane filed the fraud report the Monday before Easter. The formal cease and desist went out the same day, timed deliberately to land before the holiday. Vivian found out on Wednesday. Julian told me later that she called their mother in tears, insisting she'd only been helping the family explore options, that Naomi was overreacting to a misunderstanding. But paperwork doesn't care how something is framed. A forged authorization is a forged authorization, whether you call it help or theft. Easter Sunday arrived, and I hosted again. Same dining room, same chandelier. My mother sat at the head of the table this time, in the chair closest to the window with her chipped blue teacup set at her place before anyone else sat down. Vivian arrived 20 minutes late, and I watched her composure crack the moment she saw where my mother was seated. She tried, at first, to keep the tone light, complimenting the centerpiece, saying something about how everything looks so put together. I let her finish. Then I stood. I didn't yell. I have never yelled at this woman, not once, and I wasn't going to start in the room I'd worked 11 years to be able to afford. I laid the folder on the table, the same folder that had been sitting in that sideboard drawer since long before Thanksgiving, and I opened it in front of everyone. Presentation is everything, isn't it, Vivian? Let's talk about yours.
I went through it item by item, like a ledger, because that's what it was. The forged authorization with the mismatched flourish under the Y, the notary log number that didn't match, the $19,000 owed to a supplier who had already called Preston twice, the $9,200 earnest deposit Denny Realty had accepted on a house that was never for sale, the voicemail, which I did not play out loud. I didn't need to humiliate her the way she'd humiliated my mother. I only said that it existed, and that Renata had already given a signed statement to my attorney. Vivian's face changed in front of 12 people, not into anger, into something smaller. She said quietly that she hadn't meant for it to go that far, that she'd been terrified of losing the store, of Preston finding out, of being the Willems who finally failed at something after a lifetime of being told presentation was everything. For one moment, I saw an actual person under all that polish, someone who had built her entire identity on looking like she belonged somewhere and was drowning trying to keep up the appearance. Julian's mother pressed her hand to her mouth when I read the $19,000 figure aloud. Julian's father, a man I had never once seen raise his voice or lower it, asked Vivian directly whether the voicemail Renata described was real. Vivian didn't deny it. She just nodded once and looked down at her own hands the way my mother's hands had gone still around that teacup 5 months earlier. There was a kind of symmetry in that moment I hadn't planned and couldn't have staged if I'd tried. I let the silence sit there for a moment before I kept going, because I wanted every person at that table to have time to understand exactly what they were looking at. Not a misunderstanding, not a family squabble, but a documented, dated, provable attempt to sell a house that was never for sale, funded by a lie to a husband and aimed at a mother-in-law who had never done a single thing to deserve any of it. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt something closer to tired and something close to sad for her. But sympathy for her fear didn't erase what she'd done to my mother or what she'd tried to do to my home. Preston, sitting beside her, asked quietly if we could keep this between the families, settle it privately, maybe have Vivian pay back what she owed without any formal record. I understood why he asked. Nobody wants their family's worst year written down forever. I said no. I'm not interested in keeping this quiet, I told him. The report is already filed. What I am interested in is this ending here, cleanly, so nobody in this family ever has to wonder again whose name is actually on that deed. My terms were simple, and I stated them once. Vivian would issue a real, spoken apology to my mother in front of the family for what she said and done for over a year. Not a card, not a text, a real apology, out loud.
The fraud report stayed filed. I wasn't withdrawing it, and Denny Realty would be returning the earnest deposit to the interested buyer with a formal letter clarifying the listing had never been properly authorized. Vivian would also repay my mother the money she'd quietly borrowed and never returned, every dollar of it.
itemized, the way Diane had itemized everything else that afternoon. And Vivian would have no further involvement, ever, in any decision about my house. No comments about its value, no questions about its future, nothing. The house was mine. It had always been mine. It was time everyone, including her, said that out loud. Nobody at that table argued with the terms. I think, by that point, even Vivian understood that what she'd been offered was generous compared to what the law could have done with a documented forgery attached to her name. Diane had told me beforehand that I could have pushed for far more: restitution well beyond the borrowed cash, a formal statement to the county recorder naming her directly, even the possibility of a criminal referral depending on how aggressively I wanted to pursue it. I chose not to. I wasn't interested in destroying her. I was only interested in making sure she never again mistook my family's dignity for something she was entitled to spend. Vivian apologized to my mother that afternoon, in the dining room, in front of everyone who had heard her call her the maid 5 months earlier. It wasn't a warm moment. It wasn't tearful reconciliation set to music. It was quiet, a little stiff, and completely necessary. My mother nodded, thanked her, and picked up her chipped blue teacup, and that was the end of it. If this story is landing for you, that's what Legacy Belle is built on. Not revenge for its own sake, but the moment somebody finally has to say the true thing out loud. Subscribe and tell me, would you have settled quietly or would you have wanted it on paper the way I did? In the months after, the boutique's flagship store closed for good in June, and Vivian took an operations job at a friend's marketing firm, a real job with a salary and a badge, and none of the performance she used to run on. Preston stayed with her, though something between them looked different at family gatherings after that. Quieter, less showy, more honest. Renata became unexpectedly one of my closest friends in the family. She still tells people she has no idea what possessed her to keep that voicemail, only that some part of her knew it mattered before she understood why. Denny Realty Group returned the $9,200 earnest deposit to the disappointed buyer within 30 days, along with a formal letter confirming the listing had never been properly authorized. Carla Denny herself called me directly to apologize, saying she'd trusted paperwork that should have raised more questions than it did. I told her I understood, and that I hoped her agency tightened its verification process, because I doubted I'd be the last person this could happen to if nothing changed. Julian's mother sent my mother a handwritten card that spring, the first one she'd ever sent her in 8 years of family gatherings, thanking her for her patience and, in careful, deliberate language, apologizing for not seeing sooner what had been happening in her own dining room. My mother kept that card in the same drawer as her chipped blue teacup's felted pouch. She never mentioned it again, but she never threw it away either. Julian and I talked, eventually, about his silence at Thanksgiving. He told me he'd frozen, that he hadn't known how to stand between his sister and his wife, and that watching me handle it with paper instead of anger had taught him more about backbone than any argument could have. I believed him, mostly, because his mother told me privately, a few weeks later, that she'd misjudged how long she should have let it go on before saying something herself, and that she wouldn't make that mistake again. My mother still comes to every holiday now. She still brings the chipped blue teacup in its felted pouch, and it still sits at her place before anyone else's, because some things, once you fix them permanently. She never asked for an apology. She never asked me to do any of this. She simply kept showing up with grace and let me be the one who finally said what should have been obvious from the start. That presentation means nothing if it isn't built on something true, and that a woman who raised me with $11 an hour and 22 years of Saturdays will always outrank anyone who ever needed a title report to know who she was talking to. That's the story. If you made it this far, thank you for sitting with it. This is Legacy Belle, and we tell the stories about the moments people finally get to be seen for exactly who they are. Subscribe, ring the bell, and tell me below, who's the person in your life who deserved to be seated at the head of the table a long time ago?